Disclaimer, I do not have all the answers, nor do I claim to have all the answers. Do not treat what I say as gospel and do not use it to talk down to aspiring writers. I'm just summarizing other people's ideas. Check the description for more information, and now on with the video. Welcome to part 3 of our discussion on story structure. In part 1, we asked, what is a story? And the general definition most people agree on is, it is a representation of a story world undergoing change. That change is represented through events. And there's 2 kinds of main events you focus on, the kernel events, things that change the story world, and the satellite events, scenes that illustrate the change. Whether you're using the 3-act structure, or the hero's journey, or the story circle, or Kisho Tenketsu, or just improvising, all stories are basically changes and characters reacting and adapting to those changes. Then in part 2, we began our discussion on narrative discourse, specifically the structure. Not to be confused with plot structure, narrative structure looks at the narrative instance, who is telling the story to who on what occasion, the narrative time and space, in what order do you tell the story, which affects how the audience experiences it, and the narrative levels, where do you put the information. Now, while the events tell you what happens in the story, and the narrative structure tells you in what way do you tell the story, we still have to tell the story proper. For that, we turn to presentation. How do we transmit the story? This includes the medium, on what media do you tell the story, the meta-narrative, what's the theme and ideology behind the story, and the style and tone, what's the emotional mood and level of realism you're going for in the story. Going back to classical communication theory, media is anything that can send information from a sender to a receiver. I know that sounds like a pretty boring definition, but when put into context, it explains how stories work. A writer writes a story and it goes to a reader. Somebody designing a radio play or an audiobook records the sounds, and that sound then goes to the listener. Somebody making a digital video like this records everything, edits everything, and then it goes over the internet to you. There are different ways we can use media, and different media have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to telling stories. Going back to the previously mentioned narratologist Marie-Laure Ryan, she categorizes narrative media types into 3 categories. The first would be your spatial media, which is mostly still images, but you can still tell stories in still images. A great example would be the comic series Little Nuns. It tells the story of a couple little nuns entirely in dialogueless still images, but you can still tell something's going on. Then we got the temporal media types. These happen in time. This would include the linguistic media, such as prose, because it takes time to read, or acoustic media told entirely in sound. A great example of a story told entirely in sound would be The Caretakers Everywhere at the End of Time, telling the story of somebody suffering Alzheimer's disease entirely in music samples. Then you've got the linguistic acoustic, which includes both sound and dialogue, which would include things like radio plays and audiobooks. And finally, the third category is spatiotemporal. It happens in space and time. It can be static, it doesn't move or evolve. A good example would be comics, because they happen in space, but you also have to read them, and the frames are in sequence, meaning they happen in time. And you have the kinetic spatiotemporal works, which includes things like plays, videos, and video games. If this seems like a bit of an overcomplication of how media work, it tells you that you have options when it comes to storytelling. If you're a visual artist, but you're not very good at writing prose works, you can tell stories entirely in images like Little Nuns. If you're good at making audio works tell stories, but you're not very good at visuals, you might want to focus on making radio plays or audio dramas. Now, although event structure tends to stay the same across the different media, how you put it together will vary upon which media you are using. How you write a prose story has a different flow and feel than you would writing a screenplay, which has a different flow and feel than writing a comic, which has a different feel from writing a radio play, and so on. Now, if you want to get the best use out of your media, I would suggest looking up media codes. These are how all the different media work and your options that go into them. For example, if you're going to be working in prose, then you would look up the linguistic codes. This includes rhetorical devices and modes of address. I covered a lot of these in my video on the Diddles system for writing style. If you're going to be working in the audio, then you would look up audio codes. Things like sound that's already in the scene, known as diegetic sound, and sound that's edited in later, non-diegetic sounds. If you're working in visual media, you would look up visual codes for composition, color, and iconography. You got technical codes for camera angles, editing, lighting. There's pretty much media codes for everything, and it's beyond the scope of this video. Just look up media codes or media literacy. In the least, you'll understand why people make creative choices the way they do. Another thing to keep in mind about media relating to storytelling is that every medium has a storytelling strength. In Robert McKee's classic book Story, he talks about the difference between prose, auditory media, and visual media. Prose has the advantage of portraying a character's inner landscape, their thoughts and emotions, better than the auditory and visual media. In auditory media, you would have the characters give monologues, and in visual media, you can only have close-ups of characters. In auditory media, you can focus on sound and dialogue. And visual media, you can focus entirely on images, foregoing the need for dialogue. You can tell silent stories, which is how it started with silent films. Moving on, let's cover the concept of metanarrative, which is the tone of the ideology of the story. This here is a simplification of Hayden White's concept of metanarrative, but a little simplified to make it easier for writers to use. The first thing we need to ask is the story literal or thematic and allegorical? In a literal story, what you see is what you get. It's focused on realism, while thematic and allegorical stories, characters are meant to represent something else. Compare Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House to Herman Melville's Moby Dick. One of them is a domestic drama about a domestic drama, and the other one is a whale documentary meant to symbolize man's battle over nature against God. And if that last line sounded pretentious, just pretend it's literally just a documentary about hunting a whale. Next up, we have plot-driven stories versus character-driven stories, or as Hayden White refers to them as determinism versus free will. Do the characters drive the events, or do the events force the characters to react? An example here would be The Breakfast Club versus Jurassic Park. In The Breakfast Club, a bunch of kids are forced into detention, and they create the events to amuse themselves and get through the day. The characters create the events. Meanwhile, in Jurassic Park, the characters are there, but then they are forced to react to getting eaten by a bunch of frickin' dinosaurs. The characters react to the events. Next up, we have that TV tropes classic, the sliding scale of idealism to cynicism. Yes, this is an actual meta-narrative concept. Does the story portray humanity as basically good and our best days are ahead of us, as seen in many Disney films and animated classics? Do we believe that humanity is basically doomed and we're all pretty much screwed? Or is it something in the middle that says that humanity can be either or, but if we try our best, maybe we can make it another day? This also applies to the shape of the plot, also known as the emplotment. Ideal stories tend to go from bad to good. An example here, 42nd Street. A down-on-her-luck actress looking for work, bad, ends up becoming a Broadway superstar by the end, good. While cynical stories go from good to bad. In Fight Club, a spoiled, well-to-do office worker, good, ends up joining a fight club to make himself feel better and accidentally causes the collapse of society, bad. And finally, if you're working with historical events or an existing property, there's adaptational tightness versus adaptational looseness. How closely do you follow the source material, and how much do you take creative liberties with it? The quick version of this is compare the 2023 Super Mario Bros. Movie with the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie. One of them's exactly like the video games, and the other one, they took a few creative liberties. But neither of these are inherently good or bad. They are simply your options, just like the other elements of meta-narrative. If we were to look at page-to-screen adaptations, where we go from prose to visual media, you have tight adaptations like The Exorcist, American Psycho, Fight Club, and To Kill a Mockingbird. But on the other hand, we also have loose adaptations like A Christmas Story, Running Man, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers. Both fit at the opposite ends of the meta-narrative options, and yet they still work as memorable stories. But you can also play with meta-narrative to create entirely new story executions. A good example of this would be the biopic Man on the Moon about the life of actor-comedian Andy Kaufman. On one hand, it was an extremely tight adaptation of Andy Kaufman's life. It recreated historical footage and even got the people involved to play themselves in the movie. However, they changed the order of the events to create an idealistic emplotment. So we have a tight adaptation of the events, but in a different order. And finally, coming to the end of our journey, we have style and tone, which is simply realism versus absurdity and dark versus light. When it comes to realism versus absurdity, we're just asking how realistic is the story being portrayed? At one end, we have reality as lived. We can go down the line a little bit and still have a realistic fantasy or sci-fi setting. But as we go down the line, we get things like stylized fight scenes, cartoon-style violence, and musical numbers. Then finally, when we reach the other end, we descend into pure surrealism. The rules no longer apply, and the only thing we can expect is the unexpected.
This would fit right over here.
And finally, tone is just the mood of the story, regardless of the content within it. Now, although it is possible to have a dark mood over dark content or a light mood over light content, you can mix and match these. You can have a dark mood over light content, typical of many action adventures, or you can have a light mood over dark content, typical of many satires and dark comedies. You can even take the same scene, apply two different moods, and get two totally different results. Compare this scene. Are you still on the couch eating cookie dough? Angela broke up with me. You gotta let that go, man. Why don't you go outside, smell the roses, get some fresh air? Those aren't going anywhere. To this scene. You, still on the couch eating cookie dough? Angela broke up with me. You gotta get a hold of yourself, man. Why don't you go outside, get some fresh air, smell the roses? Those aren't going anywhere. As you can see, one would fit in a romance comedy and one would fit in a bathos-driven drama. And there you have it, the presentation portion of narrative discourse, part of narrative structure, specifically how medium, ideology, and personal style affects the story you tell. Now, we're out of time this time, but next time we're going to cover the concept of genre, and then finally, how we're going to put this giant glut of information together to build a story. I'll see you folks next time, hopefully not too long away. You can tell how long I procrastinate on these videos based on my haircut and beard length. In the meantime, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll see you all later, and good luck in your writing endeavors.